we forget sometimes that the soul does not reset like a calendar, it integrates. And so, if we skip integration in the name of spiritual growth and just patching up the outsides, then this can oftentimes be spiritual bypassing. Hello, gorgeous souls. Welcome back to the Maybe Mindful podcast. I'm your host, Hannah Mae, and this is the first episode of 2026. So I thought we'd talk about something that is very pertinent to January energy. And in the light of coming off of this really sacred pause that the world seems to shut down for globally, pretty much across the board. Maybe we don't all celebrate the same stuff, but there is a peace and a sacred silence and so much opportunity that we're called into for deeper reflection. And so in January, a lot of us are setting out with fresh intentions, high resolve, maybe new spiritual commitments, prioritizing some aspect of our health. If you're one of my listeners, you're on a personal growth journey, a spiritual growth journey, and you're really wanting to evolve, grow, and more deeply understand. I know a lot of my listeners are seekers, and the votes came in on this because I put a poll out on Instagram, and everybody requested for understanding why spiritual bypassing gets in the way of healing. And I was actually really surprised by that, but that was the vote. So I'm excited to talk about this. This idea of setting intentions and resolutions, even though those can be a little tricky sometimes, while they're really good and holy things, we forget sometimes that the soul does not reset like a calendar, it integrates. And so if we skip integration in the name of spiritual growth and just patching up the outsides, then this can oftentimes be spiritual bypassing. So I'm going to explain what this is. I'm going to talk about why we do it to bring some softness and compassion, because it's very human. I mean, it's definitely easier to be human than it is to be spiritual. If that were not the case, then we'd probably have no more problems in the world because we'd all be highly spiritualized. There'd just be true love and light everywhere. And, that's not the case. And part of the reason is because of this idea of skipping the necessary work in order to integrate and optimize the result and the fruit of our labor, of our spiritual work. I'm also going to give you a ton of examples, and all of these examples are going to be very nuanced, and you're going to see that they're very holy ideals, good ideas, great concepts, but they can be used against us. And essentially, we weaponize them against ourselves and others sometimes. So what is spiritual bypassing? Spiritual bypassing is using spiritual concepts, practices, ideals, beliefs in place of directly dealing with things that come up in us through our experiences. So unresolved emotional wounding, anger, grief, fear, trauma, difficult life situations, things that feel confrontive for us that maybe, or feel new for us that we don't feel equipped to deal with. It is a form of avoidance, and it's often rooted in self-protective mechanisms from facing what we think, consciously or subconsciously, will be too painful. So oftentimes we stay in denial. So it can look like denial of feelings. It can look like spiritual superiority. It can look like judgment and condemnation. And this is really a result of unresolved shame in the person judging and something they haven't faced in themselves. It can look like submissiveness in the name of a holy concept or ideal. And the thing to understand about this is that people are not usually consciously aware that they're bypassing. It's often unconscious, and we're just asleep or we're asleep until we're ready to wake up, and until the thing that we're not willing to address becomes more painful than the fear of addressing it. Does that make sense? Overall, it doesn't make you well because unaddressed issues continue to deteriorate our spiritual condition. And when we just love and light everything and try and go through the mechanisms of, or be in alignment with our faith without actually doing the deeper integration work, then we don't really get to to witness and experience the fruits of that. So some examples of spiritual bypassing, and this is a really big one and a really common one, but using empathy, compassion, and forgiveness to excuse harmful behavior and not face and process the grief, the anger, or set the boundary that the situation is calling you to do, or the necessary action that you're needing to take to prioritize self-care, or maybe to speak up on behalf of somebody else even. And so it's sort of like saying, oh, I understand why they did that. They're just wounded, and addressing first your compassion for them before you've found compassion for yourself. And the thing about this is, and we've talked about this before on some of my other episodes, I did an episode on this specifically around compassion and forgiveness and that process. But true compassion for others grows to the measure that we have found it for ourselves. And so this inward journey has to happen first before the external one can be actualized and manifested, before we can live up to those forgiveness ideals. And so a lot of times people feel guilty if they haven't forgiven, and they have not found forgiveness for themselves, or they have not found compassion for what they went through. This can really show up and be present in codependent dynamics, in people-pleasing dynamics, in abusive or dismissive dynamics. And even if those dynamics are not present in your life today, you can still be living in the unresolved, unhealed energy of those if you experienced any of them in your early attachments, and then they can get projected onto your current life and sort of just put a filter, an unresolved pain filter over everything. And so then we can keep living that out over and over again until we've properly addressed and processed these unresolved feelings and energies. And the thing is oftentimes, we're called to set a boundary because anger is a necessary emotion and response in order for us to take a new action for ourselves. So, boundaries can feel harder to set than the resentment. So it can be easier to just jump straight to love and light and forgiveness. And I forgive. But you know that you have not truly forgiven if you're walking around really triggered and still easily wounded all over again. And I really see this, I've seen this with clients before, where they don't want to villainize their parents. They feel guilty. They don't even feel they have permission to honestly address their anger. I see people also not wanting to acknowledge anger towards their children because they feel wrong for having it. But the importance of really being honest and meeting yourself where you're at is critical. And it doesn't mean you stay there. You don't stay in the immaturity of villainizing your parent or your child. You do have to individuate. You do have to move into a new perspective, but you can't do that unless you really meet yourself where you're at and feel supported in doing that, right? And usually this has to happen in a container where there is co-regulation, and it can be really helpful to do this in the presence, being witnessed by somebody else, and to have an experience where it is safe to express those things. It is safe to be seen in those things. And that alone, somebody showing up for you in the right container, in a group setting, in a therapeutic setting, can be everything that you need in order to re-inform you of what safety feels like in order to be able to move forward in that and process that stuff. So another example that I want to give is toxic positivity. And this can be just so annoying because if you've ever been dismissed and been told to just, look at the silver lining, or just stay positive, or worse, if you've been shut down or told that you're complaining when you're just expressing honestly, that can feel really frustrating. And it's as if honesty is less spiritual than positivity. But when a spiritual perspective is authentic, you're not ignoring and avoiding anything. You first have to face and move into what is. And maybe you have to accept disappointment. Since God already knows how we feel, it's not like we're hiding something, and pretending doesn't bring peace. It only delays it. To really surrender in that, to surrender in the disappointment, and then be open and receptive to seeing things new, like having an open mind, and then waiting, asking for help, bringing it into prayer and meditation. But a lot of toxic positivity, especially when you're experiencing it or on the receiving end of it, is just people's discomfort, intolerance, right? And not knowing how to hold space for disappointment or grief. And this can really be rooted and traced back to not being allowed to authentically express dissatisfaction or release emotions that are trapped in the body. So for example, as a kid, if you were not allowed to tantrum, if your tantrum was shut down, whether it's through rage or through shame, or if that process, that natural, necessary shedding process that a child so wisely knows how to do and release, if that's interrupted, punished, or shamed, then what happens is it becomes unprocessed, stored, trapped emotional energy in our bodies. And then we have this emotional tantrum energy sometimes, and that can come forward in rage or like anger that we can't control sometimes because your system has not learned how to move it. And then people have a lot of shame and guilt around that. And this is why embodiment and regulation is so important, and it's not just about thinking differently. It really has to be deeper. You're releasing what got trapped. And so there's a variety of ways to do that subconsciously and somatically. Okay, so here's another one. And this one is definitely a trigger point for a lot of people. Quoting scripture or spiritual principles to avoid accountability. So it's like using God or spiritual law to condemn others, to not look at themselves, to focus on shortcomings, and then elevating oneself as more awakened. And it's sort of like this idea that my sins are better than your sins. This was really clearly exhibited and displayed through cancel culture. And, this unfortunately is why a lot of people have excessive judgment towards Christianity as being condemning. The faith itself is not condemning. If you understand the principles and the foundation of Christianity, it is the opposite of condemning. But when unhealed people use it this way, and they're not actually in deep alignment, and they're not embodying their faith and presence of Christ and the Spirit of Christ, then they're setting poor example. And it's just sort of a thing. And it's also where this idea of I'm not religious, I'm spiritual comes from. But in actual practice, like religion and spirituality, there should be no separation between the two. It's like, how can there be if you really think about that, if those concepts are actually being lived and embodied. But again, healing has to happen. And any sort of block we have to our concept and understanding of God has to be removed and healed. And that usually goes back to our early attachment wounds as well, in order to be able to accept that presence and really live it. Okay, here's another one. Becoming fanatical about causes instead of facing personal pain. So like activism replacing inner work, even if it's for like a really holy and good high cause. So then it's like over identifying with that loss of self, and then these external battles replacing inner honesty. And people can really lose themselves in this, and it can become a little bit, what's the word? Irate. That's the word I'm thinking of. And so obviously it's not wrong to care, and certain causes are put on our heart for us to maybe fight or advocate for and bring awareness around. But you see people sacrificing principles of love and respect in the name of their cause when they're over-identified with it and they haven't addressed the deeper issue in themselves. Okay, here's another one. Trying to fix or diagnose others instead of yourself. This just screams self-avoidance and self-abandonment, actually, and a lot of unresolved pain. So if you find yourself being overly fixated on somebody else's issues, the solutions that they're needing, the healing that they're needing, diagnosing their problem, and living in their pain, then that says there's probably something in you that you are really avoiding that is needing your attention. It doesn't bring you peace. There's no finish line because everybody is a work in progress. And until you find this peace and healing and acceptance in yourself, you will not, because by the way, it doesn't work to fix anybody else either. That is their work. And it's just a misdirected focus. So, we can have this facade of like do-gooder and wanting to help and be of service and self-abandon. And that really is very codependent also. It doesn't bring us back to our identity. It severs and disconnects us from our true self, from God within. And there's obviously just major avoidance happening there. So that's all I'm going to say about that. I have a lot of episodes on codependency and people pleasing. Okay, here's another one. Using prayer, meditation, or spiritual practices or concepts to avoid practical issues and facing what is really needing our attention in life. So prayer is sacred, yes. This spiritual union needs to be the foundation of all our other relationships in order for them to be successful, yes. But there also needs to be balance here, so that it doesn't become a bypass and it doesn't become escapism. And I get wanting to really drop into that space and just stay there sometimes. But if I'm doing it at the cost of my kids burning down the house, then that's sort of a problem and there's an imbalance there. Maybe a better use, just going to throw it out there, better use of that time, that quiet, sacred time, is to seek strength, seek direction, or that which you're needing in order to show up and face what you need to and serve how you need to in your walk, rather than just like sitting there and being like, I'm just going to meditate and think of nothing, which isn't possible anyways. Your mind will never think of nothing. Your subconscious, the quieter your conscious mind gets, the more your subconscious will present. So there's actually no such thing as a totally quiet mind in that regard. So with spiritual bypassing, we can gloss over the cracks. We can love and light everything in order to hold up and maintain a certain exterior to make us feel or look better, to convince others or ourselves in that process. But ultimately, the real work happens, the transformation happens, and the spiritual union that we're seeking happens in the descent, because that's when we become humble enough to actually receive. And this is where we are met by the divine. And this is where we're elevated once we stop struggling, once we stop trying to ascend on our own power, because we actually don't have that ability. It's something that we have to allow. And it happens through surrender. And this is where transformation happens. This is where we transmute our pain and we're elevated to these plateaus that we couldn't get to on our own. Okay, are you ready? Here's another one. Discouraging boundaries in the name of unconditional love. This is like where spiritualized love overrides discernment. And, not having boundaries or saying, oh, it's just God's will, and excusing somebody. So unconditional love without boundaries is self-abandonment. It's actually not love. True love includes clarity. True love includes a no. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is say no. And the kindest thing you can do for yourself is to honor an authentic no. If we're enabling somebody, that's not spiritual. That is actually at its core, and this is going to sound harsh, but it's self-serving, because it's not wanting to feel the discomfort of doing the kinder thing. And here's another one, and it's sort of related actually, and segues nicely: spiritual submission and patriarchal conditioning. glorifying submissiveness in the name of like a religious concept or ideal, right? And again, these are really beautiful feminine qualities, but always being agreeable, always being nurturing, always being a good girl, being nice, always being gentle, always being accommodating when something else might be called for you to step into your strength. And this can become very enabling for sickness. This is really exhibited around sexual energy, and sexual energy is the most powerful and creative energy on the planet. So naturally, there's going to be some imbalance and it's going to be weaponized. And there's a lot of shame around this, unfortunately, that's unresolved. But I've witnessed, for example, and this was not my experience at all, but mothers with sexual shame who impress on their daughters that women are responsible for men's reactions or behaviors. And likewise, men also being given a pass or being taught that women are responsible for managing male desire. Both parties carry a powerful sexual energy, and both parties are responsible for themselves. And, God gave us authority over our own beings, and we're not responsible for others. And there is a way to conduct ourselves that is in alignment with authenticity, that is appropriate, that is authentic, that is expressive, that there is a place for, that it is holy. But when it's suppressed and when it's blamed and when there's this unnecessary burden put on anybody, and this can also be put on men also, like it can go both ways, then shame can make it really destructive. So the hidden cost of bypassing is that suppression takes this enormous energy and symptoms multiply. They show up in so many ways, and I've seen it with clients again and again, that avoiding pain costs more than meeting it because it will show up as completely seemingly unrelated symptoms. It will eke out sideways if it's not addressed. So the main culprit here, and the reason why people don't want to face this stuff, is fear. And the thing about fear and the reframe here is that fear is a non-event. And so if we stay in fear, then it continues to generate force and control over our lives, and it continues to spin a story. But because it's a non-event, it's a future event that we're imagining is real. Yes, it may be based on past experience, but this is why we heal, so that it doesn't have to dictate our present reality and our future. And oftentimes clients they won't want to commit to doing a session because they're afraid that it's going to be too hard, or they're afraid that it's going to come up even more and cause them more pain. And there's this idea that it's never going to end. But again, suppression costs more, and usually people can resolve these things very, very quickly once it's honestly been confronted. But if it's never been honestly confronted, then they just don't have that experience. Now, if you have had that experience in your life, then perhaps you can really draw wisdom from it and start to say, okay, how can this experience that I had where I overcame this and I was safe and I knew I was okay, how can I apply this to this, and is that accessible for me to move into? The good news is that the challenges we avoid are not punishments. They are invitations to integration. They are calling us back to wholeness. Healing is not forced, of course. It can be one teaspoon at a time, to whatever degree we're ready to receive. My journey has been such an evolution over decades. Decades. Like, I would say, I really feel like I started my healing journey in my teen years, and I started seeking long before that. And then when we are ready, rapid transformation can happen, which is really cool. The solution is building trust through surrender and receptivity, to be open to receiving consolation, aid, and support. Co-regulation is so powerful, to be able to, like I said, do this work in a container with somebody who can witness you, to help you feel seen, which is oftentimes the wound and what we're needing, actually. permission, right? To feel anger, sadness, to know it's okay, to be able to get through it once, and to have that faith building experience and build that endurance. I'm a huge fan of the subconscious work. You know this. I'm a huge fan of building and growing and evolving a spiritual practice. You know this. And I'm a huge fan of embodiment work through movement, through dance, through creative expression, flow arts, which I love. And keep your ears and eyes out for a future episode on that, because that is coming up soon. So please know that if this is on your radar and you're open, you're not broken, you're adapting wisely, you are responding to something deeper being called in you, and you are held in that process. All right. Love y'all. Happy New Year. See you next time. Thank you for tuning in to the Maybe Mindful podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a review. Your feedback helps us grow and improve. For more information, resources, and exclusive content, visit our website at maybemindful.com, or go ahead and follow us over on Instagram at maybemindful. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please give me a follow, screenshot the episode, and go ahead and tag me until next week when I bring you another thought-provoking and inspiring topic. Until then,